Hello and welcome back to another episode of Common Knowledge, the show where I take a look at 10, count them 10, common Magic the Gathering cards, and then I'll tell you if they're any good in the Pauper format or not, the format where you can only play commons. That's why we call it Common Knowledge. Before I get started, I did make a promise at the end of my last episode that we missed a card. As we were doing last episode, it was a whole back forward, whatever. And I just lost it, and I said I'd take a look at the edit and then grab it. You might have seen it if you paused the YouTube video, but we are going to start with this card instead of hitting randomize, and then we'll randomize after that. But we're going to start with Eager Shade, which is 2 and a black for a 2/3 Phyrexian Shade. At the beginning of your end step, if an artifact or creature was put into a graveyard from the battlefield this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. That's not bad. It's not good enough for Pauper, but it's not bad. I do like these cards that get bigger and bigger over time. They generally end up being pretty cost efficient. This one, not as much, because it is a 3-mana card instead of a 2-mana card. And I think most of the cards that you want to have this kind of growing idea are going to be 2-mana. You're a Johnny's Pride Mates of the world, which, I mention every time, not available in Pauper for some reason. That'd be so good. Put a Johnny's Pride Mate at common. What are you doing, Wizards? But we do have cards like Gixian Infiltrator, which is one whenever you is it you or anybody? I think it's you. Gixian Infiltrator. Whenever you sacrifice another permanent, put a 1/1 counter on this creature. This is a 2-mana card. This sees a lot of play, especially in like black sack decks. Carrion Feeder and Mortician Beetles also see those black sacrifice. Gixian Infiltrator will also see play in Jund because you're playing a lot of the sacrifice 1, draw 2 cards. You're also playing the landscapes in Jund, so you have a lot of things that get sacrificed in that deck. So Gixian Infiltrator will also oftentimes show up and become a nice big creature over time. But I do really like this idea of creature. This one has a couple things going poorly for it, though. One is the mana cost, like I mentioned. Now, it does try to make up for that by saying, well, this starts as a 2/3, so it lives longer. But the other one is a little bit more unforgivable, which is this at the beginning of your end step part. That clause makes a huge difference here, because Gixian Infiltrator can get that trigger multiple times per turn. This will only get that trigger one time on just your turn. You don't get it at the end of each end step, and that's a big bummer. So this thing will start as a 2/3, and maybe you put an artifact or creature. I guess it's just an artifact or creature. It doesn't have to be just yours. So that's nice. That does open it up a little bit. But again, you can only get this trigger once each of your turns. So potentially, the turn you put this out, this could be a 3-mana 3/4, which is okay. And then becomes a 4/5, becomes a, well, you know what happens after that. And I think for a card that has no sort of evasion with it, this ends up just being disappointing, and you should play Gixian Infiltrator instead. It's in the same colors. It just does more. And we've had other cards that do similar kinds of things. I mentioned a couple with like Mortician's Beetle, which also shows up in those black sack decks. But this doesn't quite cut it for those decks. But it's an okay card. Maybe something to consider if you're making like a really unpowered cube, or maybe even like a Pauper commander deck where you just need more of these kinds of effects. This probably goes just fine in some kind of black sack Pauper commander kind of deck. It still wouldn't be great. You'd still definitely want a bunch of other cards instead. But if you're just looking for more cards that can do this kind of effect, Eager Shade's, I don't know, probably fine. Score-wise, I think we can go for a relatively normal 2.5. Not bad, not great. So let's get back to what we really do here, which is randomize and see what happens. Transcendent Envoy, not a bad one. 1 and a white for a 1/2 enchantment creature Griffin. It's got flying, and aura spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. That's not bad at all. A 2-mana 1/2 flyer is more than you necessarily want to pay for a flyer, but with this other ability, I think you're more than happy to pay it. 2 toughness means it's not going to die so easily to everything on the board. Red players would have to use both versions of Lava Spike to both the played version, the casted version, and then the flashback version to knock this thing out with that. Or you might have to waste a whole lightning bolt on this, but they might want to do that because this is again a pretty good card. So you're getting a 1/2 flyer. That's fine. But the aura spells, the cost reducer here is pretty darn good. There's very specific decks that would want this, like Mono White Heroic, that plays quite a few aura spells. A lot of those aura spells are already 1 mana or already 1 colored pip. Ethereal Armor is a single white pip, so that's not getting reduced at all by this card. But if you are playing other kinds of cards, one that also doesn't see a ton of play, but honestly really should, because it's a Modern Horizons 3 card and must mean it's good, right? Dog Umbra. Dog Umbra is a 1 and a white. So like that's gets reduced by this. There's plenty of other cards that would get reduced by this. If you put this in a Bogle's deck, the Ancestral Mask would get reduced by 1. There's good things. And also, this is an enchantment creature. So if you do have any sort of enchantment matters stuff in your deck, this creature also counts as an enchantment, and that could matter as well. If you're playing that Ethereal Armor, this is an enchantment that adds to your count. If you're playing an Ancestral Mask in a Bogle's deck, this is an enchantment that adds to your count. Now, he doesn't have hexproof, so that's why he doesn't really show up in Bogle's decks at all. But Mono White Heroic can and will sometimes play this guy. Not as often. It's not like a staple of that deck, but it's not a bad card for that deck. Pretty cool card. Good in a lot of commander decks as well. You'll see this in a ton of commander stuff. Anything that uses auras and is in white is probably going to play this. Cost reducers in commander can go crazy. This is also a really cool cube card. Like, this is just a good card in general. I really like Transcendent Envoy. From a pure Pauper score perspective, which is what this channel's about, I can't give it anything too great, but I will. It gets over a 5 for sure. I'll give it a 5.5. In fact, I think that's nice. One of the better cards. Well, certainly the best card we've seen today, since it only had the Eager Shade to do. But maybe, who knows? Maybe we'll get better. Village Elder is a single green mana for a 1/1 human druid. You can pay a green, tap, and sacrifice a forest to regenerate target creature. That is quite the cost to regenerate a creature. Now, this is on your 1-drop, so you do just get a little extra value out of this, but there's so many good 1-drops that you could use, and this guy doesn't cut it anywhere else. Just a 1 mana 1/1, not nearly good enough, and I don't think you'd use this effect enough to make it worth it. Yeah, maybe there's something that you can do with lands going to the graveyard. This is a way of getting rid of your lands. Maybe you have some way of looping them. The regenerate can be okay. I do like that it regenerates target creatures, so it's not just regenerating itself. You can use it on something that actually matters to your deck. But overall, you just have so many other good cards to play in this slot, and I don't think a 1 mana 1/1 is really doing you many favors. I like the art. That's about it. I'm gonna go for a. I'm gonna go for a 1.9. I really don't like paying to a cost that says sacrifice a forest, and also like very narrow, sacrificing just a forest. You can't even. They wouldn't even give me sacrifice a land. Like that, at least it'd still be bad, but sacrificing a forest, now I have to play very specific kinds of lands. Ugh, I don't. Maybe I'll go down to 1.8. Yeah, let's do that. This is not great. Now, Sabatender, that is pretty good. Man, this might be better than Transcendent Envoy. 1 in a red for a 2/1 plant with reach, and it also has landfall. Whenever a land you control enters, this creature deals 1 damage to each opponent. So it's a little pinger, but for lands. And landfall is, if you're drawing enough lands, you get to do this once a turn. If you have the right cards that allow you to ramp, maybe you're doing this more than once a turn. If you get multiple of these guys on the board, now you're doing a lot of ping damage. He only costs 2. It's pretty cheap to put down. 2/1, so yeah, he's easy to pick off for sure. But 2 power, I kind of like that, and I like the reach. The reach feels really unnecessary to this, but cool that it has it. I wouldn't expect a card like this to have reach, but it just does, and that works. Um, I I like it. I do. I think we probably have better pingers in the format. You know, we have if you want to go for pure pinging stuff like Kessig, Flame Breather and Gutter Snipe and those mono red staples there, like those make a lot of sense. You also see like Black Mage's Rod and other things that will those give you those wizard tokens that will do that damage as well. And those are having to play specific kinds of cards, you know, instants and sorceries for the red ones, non-creature cards for the Black Mage's Rod and the wizards. And then this one wants you to drop lands, and lands, you know, are the only ones of those cards that I've mentioned, that or those card types that I mentioned that has a limit on how many of them you can play a turn. Now, obviously, you know, there's a limit based on how much mana you have for those other types of spells. But lands, unless you have a way of getting around it by using something like an Explorer or a Growth Spiral or something like that, you really only get to play one land a turn. So this isn't proccing all the time. You're not getting a ton of pings off it, but it is relatively solid damage turn over turn while being a halfway decent blocker and even a halfway decent attacker if you're able to clear the board and swing in for two. I don't mind that at all. He hasn't seen a ton of play that I've seen in the format, but I have heard some rumblings. I've seen some fringe play, and I want to reward it a little bit for that. I think I'm going to give it like a 5. I think I'm just going to give it a 5. Right at a 5. Sabatender, pretty cool card. Next is Iron Verdict, 2 and a white for an instant. Iron Verdict deals 5 damage to target tapped creature, and it has Foretell for a single white mana, which means during your turn, you can pay 2 and exile this card from your hand face down, cast it on a later turn for its Foretell cost. So you're still paying the full cost of this card, but you can pay it in installments if you go the Foretell route. If you go the Foretell route, though, you are foretelling what the card might be, and your opponent can take relatively decent guesses. I would say, especially in the Pauper format, because there are only so many Foretell cards in the colors that you might be playing, but there are only so many Foretell cards at common as well. You know, even in Commander, there's only a handful of these that are decent in Commander. So that you kind of get players going like, well, it could only be like Delayed Blast Fireball or this other one, and you know, I don't think it's that one, so it must be that. So they can pretty easily guess what card you're playing with this. And I think the same is generally true for Pauper players, although you don't really see any Foretell cards get much play in this format. So maybe that would be a surprise to them. Maybe they just aren't familiar with the cards. And I think this was actually pretty decent. We talk about it a lot on this channel, but 5 damage is a big threshold to get to because you have a lot of very important creatures that have 5 toughness. We talk about the Tolarian Terror all the time, and you know, you still have to pay the ward, and this is getting pretty expensive. Do you want to pay 5 mana or even 3 mana with the installment of paying 2 earlier? To take out your opponent's Solarian Terror, that might be a little too expensive. But to take out their Cryptic Serpent, to take out a Boulder Branch Golem, to take out a Gurmag Angler, to take out like any of those things, that's actually pretty good. I don't like that the creature has to be tapped, but that is a very white ability, obviously, to be able to use a card like this. White has to be a little bit more conditional on when you can do that damage. I wish it at least said, would I rather it say attacking or blocking over tapped? I think the answer is yes in this case. That gives me more options, I believe. Because if it's a creature with 5 toughness, it's probably not something that the opponent is tapping for, mana or something. I think they're probably swinging in if a creature has that much toughness, because it generally means that they have a lot of power as well. Not always, but generally. Um, Overall, yeah, it hits the threshold. I like this better than a ton of red burn spells that we see and a ton of white trick damage spells that we see. It's still too expensive and not good enough to see real Pauper play, but I do have to give it its props for hitting the threshold. That is important, and this card is doing that. So I'll go for a 2.9. If it said 4 damage, man, it would go way down. Oh, I said Transcendent Envoy might be the best card of the day, and I was wrong. This is going to be the best card of the day, probably by far. Pinnacle Killship is 7 whole mana for a 7/7 spacecraft artifact. When this spacecraft enters, it deals 10 damage to up to one target creature, and it has Station, which means you can tap another creature you control to put charge counters equal to its power on this spacecraft. Station only as a sorcery, and it's an artifact creature at 7 plus. So you have to station it. If it gets 7 counters on it, then 7 charge counters, this thing becomes an artifact creature. And also at 7 counters, 7 plus counters. So if putting more counters doesn't make a difference, but once you hit 7, this artifact creature now will also have flying. So this doesn't sound amazing. Like, this is a very expensive card, and then it's very expensive from its station cost to be able to get this to become a 7/7 flyer. That seems like a lot of effort. And yeah, it's got this Ender's Trigger that deals 10 damage to a target creature, and that's pretty cool, but you still got to pay 7 mana. We have a ton of, those 1 mana cards that will come down like Universal Solvent or something that you then pay 7 mana and sacrifice it to destroy a target permanent or a target non-land permanent or something like that. And those see very little play because they are just too expensive. When are you going to get to the ability? I can, my turn 1 play kind of does nothing if it just sits on the board like that. Those are not necessarily the best cards in the format, and that's why they don't see much play. This, however, has a deck that wants it, a very specific deck or a specific set of decks, and that's Tron decks. Any decks that's playing, Urza's Tower, Urza's Mine, Urza's Power Plant. Pinnacle Killship is a card that you have to consider. This sees probably the most play in Monstertron, where it makes the most sense, and I'll talk about why here in a second. But I can also show up in some of the other Tron variants because Tron makes one of those lands makes 3 mana, and the other 2 both make 2. That equals 7 mana, and this costs 7 mana, 7 colorless mana. So it is easier to cast a card like this using Tron. And so it is like a card that can come down and just wipe a creature off the face of the earth because you are slamming it for 10 whole damage. Let's see a Tolarian Terror live through that. But the reason Monstertron really likes this is because it is a perfect card to get with Maelstrom Colossus. So Maelstrom Colossus, also a card that shows up in the Monstertron list, probably the most famous card that shows up in the Monstertron list. It cost 8, which is more than 7, but for our purposes, that is okay, because Maelstrom Colossus is a 7/7 that comes down and has Cascade, which means when you cast the spell, you exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card that costs less. So in this case, costs less than 8, and you can cast that card without paying its mana cost. And you put the exiled cards on the bottom of your deck in a random order. So the best line that you can get when you're playing Monstertron is to cast Maelstrom Colossus. Maelstrom Colossus comes down, you start cascading, and what you really want to do is cascade into the Pinnacle Killship. So then that you get to cast for free now because it costs 7, and the Maelstrom Colossus costs 8, so this is lower. So you get to cast this for free. It enters. You do 10 damage to one of their creatures, wipe it off the face of the earth. And then, now that both cards are on the table, you can now tap Maelstrom Colossus, because it has 7 power, and you can tap it to the station ability of Pinnacle Killship. And now, the turn it's come down, you have a tapped 7/7 with your Colossus, and you have an untapped 7/7 flyer that took something out on your opponents. And now it doesn't have haste, so you're not swinging in with it immediately. But you just put 2/7/7s down. One of them flies. And you took out one of your opponent's creatures. So now next turn you're swinging in for 14. That's the Monstertron dream, baby. That is the best thing you can do in Monstertron. And it's kind of not close. Like Monstertron has other good hits. The Boulder Branch Golem's pretty good. A Brambleworm might be pretty good. There's other things that you go, yeah, sure, I'll take it. An Iron Giant sometimes gets played from the Final Fantasy set, but this is probably the best one. The interactions you can do to get a 7/7 that flies, especially in a deck that is colorless but mono green when you're playing Monstertron for the most part. Nice to get something that flies because that's not something green usually does. There's just a lot to like. This is a really good card, especially for Monstertron, but even in other Tron decks, this is a great card to just play and take out an opponent's creature, and then maybe you'll get to the station eventually and have that. But it's a nice thing to cascade into or just to use with your Tron mana. I like Pinnacle Killship. I was a hater for this card when it first came out. I didn't think it was that good. And then seeing it get played in Monstertron and seeing people do cool stuff with it, I had to completely reverse my position and buy some copies and put it in my Monstertron deck, and now I've also fallen in love with it. It's such a good card that can do really, really cool things. I'm going to give this a in a vacuum, being that it's only really good in one type of deck, I don't want to like go way high into it. I don't want to give it something like an 8, even though I think for a Monstertron deck, if you're just talking about it in that context, I think this is like an 8 or a 9 in that deck. But generally for the whole Pauper format, I still think this gets like a 7.6. It's really good. I should probably say 7.7 knowing its power and toughness. I'm gonna stick with a 7.6, but this is a really, really good card. Like I said, probably the best card we'll see today. Blade Tusk Boar is 3 and a red for a 3/2 boar with Intimidate. Intimidate says this creature can't be blocked except by artifact creatures and or creatures that share a color with it. Used to be called Fear. Fear was only for black creatures and artifact creatures, but then Intimidate shared it with some other colors. Mostly red and green would get that as well. But and it's been kind of phased out too. We don't see Intimidate very much anymore. But I don't mind it as an ability of just letting creatures get in for more damage and forcing opponents to. It's not a color hoser exactly, but it is like a color check, and I think that's kind of cool. But artifact creatures of any color can block this creature, and I think that's something people might miss a little bit. Maybe also the reason that they phased this out a little is that when Fear first came out, Fear artifact creatures were only colorless. We didn't have colored artifacts, so it made a little bit more sense. Now it makes a little less sense if I had a blue artifact creature that is now blocking this guy with Intimidate. It just doesn't feel very intuitive, I think, to a lot of players. And so that's probably the biggest reason they've switched out. And also there's just plenty of ways to make creatures tougher to block. Red has Menace, blue has just unblockability. We have other options available. You don't really need Intimidate as much anymore. That makes me a little sad because I still do like the ability. Well, I like Fear, and then kind of like Intimidate for the same reason. This is not a very good card. This is 4 mana for a 3/2 that's a little hard to block. That's not very good. If you can block this thing with anything you've got, it's pretty easy to take out or trade with. And if you can't block it, I mean, yeah, it's 3 damage every turn, but this is your 4-drop. It doesn't have haste. Like, come on. This isn't doing anything. I'm going to go for a 2.2. Next up is Barb Sextant. Single mana, colorless mana for an artifact. You can pay 1, tap, and sacrifice this artifact. To add 1 mana of any color, you draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. I feel like we did this one a long time ago, but I kind of want to do it again. I don't know if I talked about it on that episode, but I've seen this card see some play. And so I do at least want to bring that up and mention it to people. It doesn't see a lot of play. Don't get me wrong. This is not a very good card, But you see other cards that are like this, and this is from Ice Age, and it was in the Cold Snap theme deck, so it certainly hasn't seen a ton of play, or a ton of printings, I mean, and most of those printings are quite old. Cold Snap is new by comparison, I suppose, but Cold Snap is also extremely old, and before that was Deck Masters, where we're still getting all these white border versions. That's not a good sign for the printings. But think about some other cards that we do play a lot in the format. So how about Chromatic Star? Chromatic Star, single mana for an artifact. You can pay 1, sacrifice it, and when it's put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you draw a card. Yeah, it does the color fixing thing, but just focus on the drawing a card. We call that an egg sometimes in these. So, oh, sorry. What am I saying? What am I saying? This has the fixing. This also has the fixing. This is you're sacrificing this thing to add a mana of any color. So you are still color fixing. Don't know why I said that. But this is also drawing you a card. It's just drawing you a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. So you have to wait probably until your opponent's turn. Generally, you're cracking this on your turn. I guess you could do it on your opponent's turn too. But you don't get the card until the next turn's upkeep. So it is slower. It's certainly worse than Chromatic Star. But there are some decks that want to play a ton of eggs, that have ways of getting these, recycling these eggs from the graveyard and putting them back in your hand and playing them, and getting so, like, burning through your deck in that way, because you're just filtering and playing and filtering and paying, and everything's 1 mana, so it's all coming out very cheaply. The decks that kind of play this are the ones that are playing something like Pactol Terror, which every time an artifact comes into play, that drains. So that's awesome. And if you can play a ton of eggs and then bring those eggs back to your hand and play them again, and now you're just kind of looping those things, that can be really good. There are also cards that can deal damage when artifacts leave the battlefield, I think. I mean, I know there's the one that's banned. Oh, what is that guy? Something of the Damned. It's a Mirrodin card. I remember really liking it. I gotta look that one up now. He's black. He's a 1-drop. He's legal, or he's not legal in Pauper. That's very important to note. And he's from Mirrodin. Is he from Mirrodin, or is he from Mirrodin Block? I guess we can say Mirrodin Block instead, just to be sure. You guys probably already know and are shouting it out, but I need to know. Disciple of the Vault. There you go. But yeah, whenever an artifact's put into a graveyard from play, you may have target opponent lose 1 life. Man, this card's so good. So good that it's banned in Pauper. But if we ever brought it back, an eggs deck would be a great place for it, because with Pactol Terror would drain, and then you sacrifice it and it deals another damage, and you loop those things. You could do some real dirty stuff with that. That'd be very cool. But the idea here is that Barb Sextant, while not nearly as good as Chromatic Star, if you're playing a deck that plays 4 Chromatic Stars and that's all you need, don't even worry about Barb Sextant. But if you're playing a deck that goes, ooh, I want to play more of these egg style cards, this one is one you should consider. It's slower, but it's still pretty good. It's still an egg that will draw you a card, mana fix you, like all that's great stuff. So I can't give this too bad of a score, while at the same time I also can't give it too good of a score, because there's obviously other cards that just do this better. I showed you the Chromatic Star, but there are other ones as well. Is Chromatic Sphere? Chromatic Sphere is so similar. It's hard to remember exactly how it's different. Yeah, I mean, so again, Chromatic Sphere, very similar to Chromatic Star. So you'd play 4 of these as well. So Barb Sextant is not going to be copies 5 through 8 of Chromatic Star, but it will be copies 9 through 12, I guess, at that point. And there are decks that will want all 12 of these kinds of egg effects. So I do have to give it something for that, and I think that something is going to end up being a 4.7. Probably higher than you expected, but some decks really like it. Those eggs decks. Also, the other thing to mention with those egg decks is Fangren Marauder, which is probably the even better card for it, because whenever an artifact's put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you can gain 5 life. So if you're playing a bunch of eggs and sacrificing them all and gaining 5 life every time and just kind of cycling through your deck that way, you can do some real real stalling with that strategy. Pretty cool stuff. Next is our final official card of the day, and that's Eltergard. Yeah, I I'm not a D&D guy. I know this is Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. You can tell me if I got that wrong, but I'll say Eltergard Ranger, which is 4 and a green. For a 4/1 human elf ranger with reach. And when this creature enters, you create a 2/2 green wolf creature token. I'm a broken record. I know it, and I'm sorry, but we have a green creature that is 4 and a green. Is this better than Avenging Hunter? No, it's not. A 4/1 reach is, I would say, pretty bad if you're paying 5 mana for it. And yeah, they're giving you a 2/2 wolf token. So I guess this is 6/3. If you want to think about it that way, you are getting 6/3 worth of stats for 5 mana, which isn't terrible, I guess. But the 1 toughness really kills this for me. It's so easy for an Electrickery to just knock this off the board. They paid 1 for the Electrickery, maybe 2, depending on if they overloaded it or not. So they paid very little, and you paid a lot. And I guess you get to still keep the wolf token at that point, but man, that's not great. And a breath weapon takes out both. Breath weapons, that's 3 mana, and you paid 5 mana to put 2 creatures on the board, and they're both dead to a breath weapon or a fiery cannonade. That feels terrible. Like the Avenging Hunter starts as a 5/4 just on its own, which is really good. It's got trample, which is much better than reach, and it gives you the initiative, which gets you a land, puts it in your hand, and then also potentially gets you even more stuff if you are able to keep the initiative. It's just way better than this. This is a bad card. This is a bad card. You're spending a whole lot of mana on something that I don't think is very good. Reach is a very defensive ability. It only works really on defense, and but it's a 1 toughness creature. So what is it? It's going to defend against a thing once and then die. That's not what I want to spend my 5 mana on. I got to give this a bad score. I think this is like a 1.6. It's really pretty terrible. Let's do a bonus card and then call it a day. It's Coffin Purge. Not a bad one to end on. Single black mana for an instant. Exile target card from a graveyard, and it has flashback also for a single black mana, which means you can cast this card from your graveyard for its flashback cost, and then you exile the card. Coffin Purge, it's not the best graveyard hate card in the format. We have plenty of, if you're playing black, something like Nihil Spellbomb is going to generally be a card that you want to play more often. But Jukabog doesn't really take up a slot in your deck because it works as a land. The Relic of Progenitus can exile both graveyards and can exile single cards from graveyards, and your opponent gets to choose which card gets exiled, but it still is exiling individual cards. Coffin Purge is an instant, though, so unlike all those other cards that only work at sorcery speed, or in the land's case, that also kind of is played at sorcery speed. I guess not casted, but still same difference for these purposes. And this is an instant speed one, so you can individually take out a card that might really matter to the opponent. This is going to be really good against dredge decks that are trying to reanimate a very specific creature, a Lotleth Giant most of the time. So you can exile that Lotleth Giant and then have this in your graveyard ready to go if you ever show up against another Lotleth Giant, or if your opponent is trying to exhume a Troll of Khazad-dûm or something, you can exile it before it's able to be targeted. So there are times where you definitely would like this. Like, having instant speed graveyard hate is really useful in the format. And this one being able to be used twice, being able to, it's cheap both times. You see a lot of cards that will be cheap initially and have a big flashback cost, or sometimes you'll get like a Roar of the Worm, which is really expensive on one end and cheaper to flashback. Roar the Worm not not Pauper legal, but man, if it was, oh boy, I'd be playing some Roar the Worm. Coffin Purge is cool. It's a good little utility piece. It's not as good as some of the other pieces that we have. Even like the, I would say, lower B tier versions of Graveyard Hate that you see in the format. Something like a Tormod's Crypt, which is free but still has to come down at sorcery speed. That I, I still think a lot of those are probably better. This probably also goes in that B tier. I will take some cheap but very targeted Graveyard Hate for specific decks. But there are some decks that really care about your graveyard that this doesn't really help against, like Mono Blue Terror or any Terror deck really. Coffin Purge is not going to be the best card for that because they are able to put so many instants and sorceries in their graveyard that exiling one probably is only a speed bump to that player. So you really do want that Relic of Progenitus or that Nihil Spellbomb that is able to get rid of the entire graveyard and really set them back and force them to go again. This could hit, I suppose, cards that have flashback on them, though. So if your opponent is trying to do something with flashback, you can play this and get rid of that, and then it has flashback itself, so you're able to use it again. There are good reasons to play this card. I would very much suggest you have. I don't know if you necessarily need 4 copies, but I bought 4 copies of this at one point because I was like, this is just a good card to have on hand if you need. Sorry, there is one other card that probably does warrant mention, and it's the Fairy Macabre. That makes perfect sense. This one is, a card that you can discard from your hand at instant speed for free outside of discarding the card, and you can exile 2 cards, up to 2 cards from graveyards. So Fairy Macabre also sees a good bit of play. I would put this in like an A- tier, but this is probably the premier. Hey, I'm going to hit 1 or 2 target cards rather than hitting the whole graveyard like a Nihil Spellbomb does. But Coffin Purge less than that, but there are going to be times where Coffin Purge is slightly better than Fairy Macabre, just as a way of, I took out the one problem card now, and have the ability to take out another problem card later. Whereas Fairy Macabre says, I can take out 2 problem cards now, but I can't do anything later. Now I'm in your graveyard where you can't do much with it, or can't do as much with it. Anyway, this is a lot of talk for Coffin Purge. I think this is a good card. It's like a decent sideboard piece, and if you really, it would just be for sideboards. You wouldn't put this in the main deck, but it would be a good sideboard piece for very specific decks. Or if the meta shifts in a way, if Dredge comes back and Spy kind of takes a back seat, maybe if Spy ever got banned, which would be nice, we'd start to see, even if Spy doesn't get banned, Spy is also trying to bring a lot less giant back specifically. So if you see a whole lot of Spy decks, a whole lot of Dredge decks, or a whole lot of decks that are specifically trying to reanimate in Pauper, Coffin Purge becomes a better card with that. So in the current meta, I don't think it's quite as good, but it's still not too bad. And I think for a score, we'll go with a 4.6. A long road to get to a 4.6, but I think that is the appropriate score for this card. Thanks so much. We'll see you on the next episode. Till then.